Member Shavaro.
I'm here.
Chairperson Richardson.
Also here. Would you now please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Liberty and justice for all.
Item 1 is the approval of the minutes for the August 20th, 2020 board meeting.
Member Shavaro, any discussion, additions, or corrections to the minutes?
No, I'll move approval.
I second the motion to approve the August minutes.
Is there any public comment on this item?
Hearing no public comment, Council, will you please call the roll?
Member Shavaro.
Aye.
Chairperson Richardson.
Chair is also aye.
Motion passes.
The next item is a public comment. This is the opportunity for the public to comment on items that are not on the agenda. As any items discussed during public comment have not been agendized, the board is not permitted to take any action on these matters at this meeting. For those on the phone, if you previously indicated your desire to offer comments during this agenda item, we will be calling on you by name or phone number. For those participating via Zoom, please raise your hand if you wish to offer comment, and we will acknowledge you and let you know when it is your turn to speak. And we have Miss Marlene Mushane.
Hello, yes. Do you want me to go ahead?
Yes,
Sorry.
please.
Good morning. Good morning. I'm speaking this morning, not because it will change anything for me, but I wanted to share just some points of my experience with CalVCB that maybe it's a pay it forward to help others in the future. I'm a victim of domestic violence, of stalking, and the threats started. Obviously, I'd known this person for 20 years. I'd been in a relationship with them, committed relationship since 2012, so it's been some time. The threats were to harm my family, to get me fired from work, and to end the life if any other male was to have a relationship with me. Through the course of this, the threats happened in April of 2019. And over the course of time, eventually when we did things in probation is when I submitted a claim to CalVCB, which was October of 2019. I wasn't really thinking that I needed anything prior to that. What we discovered, because in August of 2019, to back up a little bit, my case is a little different than normal because it's stalking. I did seek a temporary restraining order, and from the time it was served to the first court date for the permanent hearing, it was violated. The temporary restraining order was violated every day. And by the time we had the hearing, he was taken into custody the day before, that morning of the hearing. There's been bail paid. He's been out. He's been arrested 4 times with felony stalking, in addition to over 10 misdemeanor charges, and he's been sentenced. He was just sentenced in May of this year, 2020, to the final sentencing because every time he got out, he violated it within 24 hours. And so it's gone on for such a long time and so much. How it's resulted to me because of all the stress is it compromised my immune system to where my dental, I've lost, you can see I've lost my front 2 teeth. I've lost 2 back teeth, and I'm to have 2 more teeth extracted this month because the decay, the system's collapsing. When my claim was submitted to CalVCB in October of 2019, I received the letter notifying me that it was received January of 2020. April 2020, my claim was denied because they said there was no actionable event or arrest. And it's because when my claim was filled out, we started with the very beginning, the very first time that the police were called, and I attached 12 pages of backup documenting every time the police were called, every time I was contacted, all the case reports that were included. It contained everything, 12 pages of backup, and the claim was denied. That was April 2020. In May of 2020, it was declined upon further review of submitting an appeal. I also noted on my claim that I have through University of California, Davis, I have the CARE Victims Advocate that was helping me. And they've reached out to CalVCB and they sent in the application, the exact application that was submitted the first time, again, to try to get it under appeal. And we finally got it appealed, and it took the DA's office, the victims advocate at the DA's office, actually faxing in the criminal reports in order for it to get approved. And so now I'm starting the process of trying to get my dental work taken care of. But so much has decayed from when I went in August when my teeth started breaking to now that so far I spent just under $20,000 to fix and replace this, to put implants and restore it to whole. I'm looking at another $30,000. CalVCB only covers 75% of that. The defendant is out on probation. To sentencing, he pled no contest. The reason that he was put on probation is what I was told by the probation office is there's criminals that are worse criminals that are out on probation. So he's on a GPS monitor. He's been that way since May, actually February. This last month, the end of August, I started getting emails again from him, and they're trying to prove the case again. What I'm trying to pay forward is a lot of people have been trying to help, but this whole delay in the process, things have taken so long. If they could have gotten fixed from the beginning, maybe it wouldn't have been so much money. But I'll never receive full restitution. He'll never have the money to pay. He's only working part-time. I guess what I'm trying to point out is if somebody, when they first looked at the application, would have reached out, made a phone call, said, you know what, there's a lot behind here. Maybe call the victim advocate. Maybe call the DA's office. Not even call me, but find out more about what happened. I know it's different. I know maybe we should have known to put a case number on it, not start at the beginning, but start at where arrest was made. We didn't know that. Maybe outreach to the victim advocates to know how to complete the claim form to help out a victim. I just would like that something could be made easier for the next victim to come along, because when you're a victim and you're dealing with all this, it's, I don't even know how to describe it. It's you're being victimized over and over and over again for the same crime. I don't know how, but somehow maybe speaking up, it can help somebody else. Thank you for the time to reveal this.
No, thank you for your bravery in sharing that with us and the board members and the staff today. First of all, let me just say, terrible what you've been through. Thank you for walking us through this. Before I finalize my comments, I just want to offer the member Shavaro, do you have any comments today regarding what public comment we just heard?
I do not.
Okay. Just wanted to let you know that we do appreciate, again, you sharing that, especially your spirit about wanting to pay it forward. There's always an opportunity to improve everything that we do. And your comments were very succinct and helpful. And the staff is listening, and we as board members will definitely follow up to see where we can make improvements so that we can make sure that other victims in the future will have a better experience. So thank you today for your comments.
Thank you.
I see that we have Gabriel Garcia would like to say a few words.
Yes, good morning. And I just want to acknowledge Marlene for sharing her story. I know how difficult that can be, especially in a public forum. So just really want to recognize the bravery that it took to do so. So my name is Gabriel Garcia. I am the Policy and Advocacy Manager for Youth Alive. I've commented here before, but just wanted to reiterate that we were co-sponsors of Assembly Bill 767, which would have touched on victims' compensation and made it clear that victims of police violence are eligible for victim compensation. But it also generally would have addressed different ways that law enforcement can act as a barrier for victims and trauma survivors to get the support and the resources they need to heal. Unfortunately, that bill did not pass, and we are extremely disappointed with the results of that bill. But fortunately, we were able to have a conversation with the Executive Officer Gledhill and her team last week, and we are very hopeful that we can continue a thought partnership with Cal VCB moving forward to draft a bill to actually address these challenges in a way that not only are we happy with, but in a way that Cal VCB can support and the governor's office can support. So very much looking forward to that thought partnership. Again, Cal VCB has done so much for the victims and survivors that we serve at Youth Alive here in Oakland. We just want to make sure that those resources and supports are available to all those who need it. So expressing my gratitude and looking forward to the continued partnership. Thank you.
No, thank you, Mr. Garcia, for your comments. I'm glad that you had an opportunity to touch bases with the staff on that. Really appreciate that. Member Shavaro, any comments from you?
No, I don't.
Okay, thank you.
I don't see any more comments. So we'll move to item 3. Item 3 is the Executive Officer Statement, which will be presented by Executive Officer Linda Gledhill.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair and board members. First, I also want to acknowledge Ms. Moonshine and her statement. It is very brave to be able to come to a public forum and share that. And so I do appreciate that she, as she said, wanted to pay it forward. And we will look at what she talked about and see. As the chair said, there's always room for improvement. So we do appreciate hearing those stories firsthand. And I also want to thank Mr. Garcia for coming and speaking about AB 67. I'm going to start with that in my office in my comments. You know, as I did commit to coming back to the board with an update. And as he said, the bill did not pass off a suspense file and did not move forward during the legislative year. And I do know that that was disappointing to the sponsors of the legislation, which is why I committed to continue to work on this very important issue. Last week, we had several meetings with those who supported the legislation, and we do have additional meetings scheduled on this topic. And I really do appreciate the opportunity to express some of our concerns and have a fruitful dialogue and to begin that conversation. There appears to be consensus that we can't make changes administratively and that it will require legislation. So we will continue to work with all the interested parties to try to find common ground on this important topic as we look forward to the next legislative session. So I want to thank all of those that we've spoken with to their commitment to work with us. We all want something that both meets the end goal, but is something that we feel that we are able to properly administer. And so that is really where the goal is for everyone. So in other news, we continue to see at Cal VCB a growth in our online applications, although our overall application numbers do remain down. We know because our online space will continue to see growth, we are continuing to make improvements to expand access in that area. We just rolled out an upgrade to our online access that allows advocates in 4 counties, San Francisco, San Diego, Fresno, and San Joaquin, to create an account and track online the applications for which they are the representative. They can upload documents and bills and complete applications for victims. This will allow the advocates to more easily track the applications that they have with us and provide faster service to victims. We're going to monitor the pilot in these 4 counties and then roll it out statewide. A few other highlights from the past month. A few weeks ago, all Cal VCB staff participated in implicit bias training with Dr. Bryant Marks, who is the Chief Equity Officer and Principal Trainer at the National Training Institute on Race and Equity. Arranged by the Government Operations Agency, this was originally supposed to be an in-person training in the spring, but of course was delayed because of COVID-19. Very happy that an online version of this training was offered and that all of our staff was able to participate in it. It was tremendous training. It's the 3rd time I've actually heard it, and it's great every time, which is unusual for training. So it was very good. We got great positive feedback from staff. It's so important to me that all employees learn and discuss the meaning of implicit bias, how it's measured, the effect it has on our attitudes, and ways that we can reduce and manage the implicit bias that we have as individuals and as groups. At a follow-up staff meeting, what I said to staff is I take this very seriously as the leader of this organization, and it's one we're going to continue to revisit on a regular basis because it is a message that needs to be heard over and over again, just to remind ourselves that we all have these implicit biases. It is part of being a human being with a brain, as Dr. Marks says, but we just need to be aware of them so that we can manage them. I also participated in the annual Victim of Crime Act National Training Conference, which is held every year for the state compensation programs across the country. This was held virtually this year for the first time that they've ever done that. I, along with representatives from New York and Texas, discussed emerging processes for compensation coverage. I spoke on AB 629, which we've talked about at the board meetings, gives human trafficking victims the ability to apply for income loss using alternative documentation. We are the first state to do this, so it's very interesting for other states to hear what things we are doing, and then also to hear from them what things that they are doing. So it was a great opportunity to connect with other states, and we already have follow-up meetings scheduled with both Texas and New York to discuss various issues. So looking forward to that. Lastly, Cal VCB is preparing for Domestic Violence Awareness Month, which is in October. We plan to conduct social media outreach to raise awareness about the compensation and services available through Cal VCB, including emergency wards for victims if they need immediate relocation. Also, this October is the 3rd anniversary of the Route 91 Harvest Festival mass shooting in Las Vegas. The nonprofit Give an Hour recently partnered with Cal VCB to offer support services to victims in 8 counties: Kern, Los Angeles, Orange, Riverside, San Bernardino, San Diego, Santa Barbara, and Ventura. The project is called SoCal Route 91 and will offer no-cost services, including support groups, emotional wellness training, and referral to mental health services to survivors of that tragedy. Approximately 65% of the more than 24,000 attendees of the festival were from California. So we have helped many, many victims from that tragedy. So that concludes my remarks. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Any questions or comments
No,
from member board? I
no.
just want to say thank you, Officer Gledhill. We asked last board meeting for you to, catch us up on AB 767. Really appreciate you reaching out and for your commitment to work on that in the future. So thank you for following up on that report. Also for your leadership around implicit bias. We were happy to hear that it was well received. We are continuing across the state to hear that this has really been helpful. And I think this is a really important thing for us all to be mindful of in terms of our efforts to make sure that we always hold up diversity and inclusion. And so we really appreciate your leadership within Cal VCP around that. And let us know on your Victims Awareness Month activities if there's anything that you would like the board members to do to support you and the staff.
Thank you, I will. Thank you.
Okay, moving to item 4 is the legislative update that will be presented by Cal VCB Chief Counsel Kim Gutierrez.
You're on mute, Kim.
Thank you. I didn't get too far, luckily. So good morning. I have just a short update for you this morning regarding the legislation arena. We just heard from Executive Officer Gledhill regarding AB 767, which was held on the suspense file in the Senate Appropriations Committee. Also, AB 2028, the bill that would have made minor changes to the Bagley-Keene Open Meeting Act, failed to move off the Senate floor. And that concludes my update for this month.
Any questions, Member Chavarro?
No.
Seeing there's no motion presented at this time, Council, anything else we need to do?
No, we can move on to item 5.
Awesome, thank you.
Item 5 is the penal. Yes. Item 5 is the Penal Code, Section 4900 claim of Joshua Gonzalez that will also be presented by Cal VCB Chief Counsel Kim Gutierrez.
Hello again. Joshua Joel Zamora Gonzalez filed his application for compensation under Penal Code Section 4900 based on his convictions for 3 counts of attempted murder and shooting from a motor vehicle. On October 5th, 2008, 20-year-old Jose Areola, 18-year-old Omar Vargas, and 18-year-old Brian Padilla were shot multiple times while standing on a street corner in Colton, California. One of them was wearing a Los Angeles Dodgers jacket. Earlier that night, the victims and bystanders had attended a large party at a residence near the intersection where the shooting occurred. Gonzalez, who was 17 years old at the time, had also attended the party. The victims and multiple bystanders told police the shots were fired from a dark-colored vehicle, possibly a newer model Cadillac. At least one shooter was seated behind the driver with the window down. He shouted to the victims immediately before firing, demanding to know where they were from. A possible second shooter, who was in the front passenger seat, stepped out of the Cadillac before firing. All 3 victims were struck by multiple bullets, rushed to the hospital, and survived. Following a jury trial, Mr. Gonzalez was convicted. The jury specifically found that Mr. Gonzalez had personally and intentionally fired a gun at 3 separate victims, striking all 3 and causing each to sustain great bodily injury. The jury further found that Mr. Gonzalez committed all of these acts for the benefit of a criminal street gang. The trial court sentenced Mr. Gonzalez to an aggregate indeterminate term of 86 years and 8 months to life. Mr. Gonzalez's convictions were affirmed by the California Court of Appeal and the California Supreme Court, as well as by the Federal District Court and initially a split panel of the Ninth Circuit. In July 2017, however, a majority of that same Ninth Circuit panel concluded, upon rehearing, that the trial evidence was constitutionally insufficient to support Mr. Gonzalez's conviction because no rational jury could find beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Gonzalez was the shooter. Mr. Gonzalez was released from prison on July 25th, 2017, after having served a total of 3,216 days. On August 8th, 2017, Mr. Gonzalez submitted an application to Cal VCB seeking compensation as an erroneously convicted offender pursuant to Penal Code Section 4900. Because Mr. Gonzalez lacked a finding of factual innocence, The administrative proceeding was stayed pending Mr. Gonzalez's motion for a finding of factual innocence, which was denied by the San Bernardino County Superior Court on July 24th, 2018. In the proposed decision, the hearing officer recommends denying Mr. Gonzalez's application because he has not met his burden of proof. Overall, the hearing officer concluded the compensation should be denied because the weight of the evidence presented in the administrative proceeding did not prove by a preponderance of the evidence that Mr. Gonzalez was more likely innocent than guilty. Throughout these proceedings, Mr. Gonzalez has been represented by his attorney, Mr. Jared Adams. The Attorney General's office is represented by Deputy Attorney General, Mr. Barton Bowers, both of whom I believe are present and prepared to address the board. That concludes my presentation.
Thank you, counsel. We will first hear from Mr. Jared Adams, counsel for Mr. Gonzalez.
Thank you. And good morning to the board, and thank you all for allowing me to present on behalf of Mr. Gonzalez. I want to start with explaining what led up to Mr. Gonzalez being charged with the shooting, because I believe that the proposed decision makes it seem as if Mr. Gonzalez was born on the night of his accusation, and he simply wasn't. There are a number of inaccurate representations of crucial facts, not just small minor facts. There are crucial facts that I believe that this board, if it has not at the end of this hearing decided to rule in favor of Mr. Gonzalez, I believe that this board and each member should go back through the record in its entirety, because it can be tricky with so much of the procedural road it traveled and so many witnesses who testified, and the record being restated and stated over again at each different level of appeal until Mr. Gonzalez's conviction was reversed and he came home. Mr. Gonzalez grew up in Rialto. His father was in and out of prison, and he grew up in a household where his mother was in and out, not of prison, but just in and out of the nurturing of a son to make sure that that son doesn't find his role models in the streets. That is what ultimately happened with Mr. Gonzalez. Up until Mr. Gonzalez was 16, Mr. Gonzalez had no trouble at all. He received stellar grades while in school. It was when Mr. Gonzalez had to venture out of his neighborhood to go to different events, as most teens and preteens start to do. He was getting attacked while leaving out of his neighborhood. His neighborhood is a bad neighborhood, and his neighborhood is dominated by two gangs. Mr. Gonzalez, trying to protect himself, he decided to start hanging around a lot of his grammar school friends who were identified gang members. But Mr. Gonzalez was never officially joined in any capacity into a gang. He was a kid, and those decisions would lead to 10 years of his life being robbed from him. And in a span of a year, you'll hear either, you probably already saw, or you'll hear from the Attorney General that Mr. Gonzalez's credibility should not be trusted because he has a propensity for doing something, as if he was a lifelong criminal coming out of the womb. In a year, Mr. Gonzalez's life changed dramatically and instantly. Mr. Gonzalez, along with his cousin, who he started to hang out with, he started to hang out with more and more boys as a form of protection. Mr. Gonzalez and his cousin were in the alley playing basketball or something like that. They found a rusty revolver in the alley in which they each took turns firing shots into the air. They were immediately arrested. Mr. Gonzalez pled guilty, and he spent time in juvenile hall about 3 months. Mr. Gonzalez got out of juvenile hall those 3 months. And in less than 3 months after that, Mr. Gonzalez is attending a funeral of another family member, and it's in a different neighborhood. While getting in a car on a ride home from the funeral, he's in a car with 3 gentlemen. One of these gentlemen sees a rival gang member, jumps out of the car, fires shots at that gang member, jumps back in the car. Mr. Gonzalez and the entire group is arrested. Mr. Gonzalez was never alleged to have fired any shot, never alleged to have any knowledge that anything was getting ready to transpire. This is just more and more of the spiral out of Mr. Gonzalez's life that happened. Mr. Gonzalez pled guilty to accessory after the fact with that shooting. He again and I misspoke earlier. Mr. Gonzalez with the gun incident, he was on probation. He never went to juvenile hall at all. After the incident with the shooting and the 3 gentlemen who were in the car, Mr. Gonzalez then served the 3 months in juvenile hall. He came home, and I believe he came home, I want to say in July, and I'm looking at it now. He came home in July from doing that 3 months. He attends a party in October, the night that this shooting incident happened. Mr. Gonzalez attends a party with 2 friends. He goes to this party. The party is relatively without incident. There was one moment where Mr. Gonzalez bumped into another patron at the party, but as everyone has testified and as the record will reflect, Mr. Gonzalez and this gentleman that he bumped into had absolutely no correlation or connection at all to what transpired outside of this party hours later. Although it had nothing to do with it, it still found its way in the record and grew legs as if it was evidence for the reason why Mr. Gonzalez and his friends would be firing shots at someone on the corner, which is another reason why I'm begging this board, please go back and look at the record. I promise you, there's no way that I would be standing before you and saying something is in the record and I haven't thoroughly went over it and saw it. So Mr. Gonzalez at this party, the incident that led up to the bumping at the party was when Mr. Gonzalez was speaking to a young lady who would become a crucial connection in this case to how authorities even, thought to go after Ms. Gonzalez as a suspect. So at the time that this bumping incident has happened, Mr. Gonzalez is speaking with the young lady and he's talking to her. He's trying to get her number. Doesn't work out, but he gives her his name. And he tells her his nickname. He goes by the nickname Knuckles. He had aspirations of being a boxer early on. So after this incident, hours later, everyone is leaving the party. The party had a hard stop. The party also had security. There was a security guard who was also a witness in this case as well. And he also testified that nothing in the party had anything to do with spilling out on the street as well. This party had 100 attendees in and out throughout the night. And when the party was ending, Mr. Gonzalez, along with many, many, many other cars and patrons, were leaving. And when they had to leave, it was an intersection that people had to go past leaving out of this area to make their way to the expressway or to the main street, going back to their neighborhoods. There were a group of men who are now the victims in this case. These men were not on that corner selling water. They were on the corner, they were gang banging, throwing up gang signs, they were flashing guns, and they were doing this at each and every car that went past. Mr. Gonzalez's car went past. These men did the same exact thing to them. As soon as Mr. Gonzalez's car pulled off, Mr. Gonzalez would later tell investigators in the interview room that that's when he heard the shots fired. The men on the corner were heckling everyone when they left out of this party driving past. It was obviously their neighborhood, quote unquote, so they were standing there in a group. When the shots were fired, there were multiple victims and there were also witnesses who were there on the scene. The police arrived on the scene very shortly after. They interviewed everyone who was left over from the party. One of the people who were left over from the party was this young lady that Mr. Gonzalez had tried, to date while in the party during this time, hours before. The description that was given by the witnesses and the victims was that there were 3 guys in a dark colored car. They never, ever said a model. They never said a Cadillac. They never said any model or make at all. They said it was a dark colored new vehicle. Mr. Gonzalez would say that he was later tell investigators that he was in a light red Cadillac and also told investigators who he was with and where they can go find the car to go check the car out. They refused and did not do that. But to get back to the timeline of events, when they spoke to the witnesses and the victims, They spoke to the victims in the hospital. They spoke to the witnesses who were still on scene. The witnesses said that this dark colored vehicle came past. Someone yelled something out of the car, and it was some shots fired from two people inside of the vehicle. And some witnesses said someone jumped out of the passenger side and fired shots as well. They gave one identifying marker, and that was the person that was in the back had a baseball hat on, and it was I don't know if they said it was turned to the back or they just, some of the witnesses just said he had a baseball hat on. Investigators took that information and interviewed other people who attended the party. That's when they came across this young lady Mr. Gonzalez was speaking to. And she says she was talking to a guy, and the guy she was talking to introduced himself as Knuckles, and he wore a baseball cap. That was the end of the investigation for authorities. They immediately looked up, called around to different bodies of police agencies to see if anyone used the moniker Knuckles. Came back to Rialto and Mr. Gonzalez. Because Mr. Gonzalez was on probation for the incident in which he pled guilty to accessory after the fact, they didn't need a warrant. They immediately showed up to Mr. Gonzalez's house, after processing the scene. Mr. Gonzalez was taken out of his bedroom. They searched the entire house, its surroundings, cars, the grounds, and absolutely nothing was found. Not a gun magazine, not a gun cartridge, not bullets, nothing at all was there that was linking Mr. Gonzalez to this shooting at all. Despite that, they took Mr. Gonzalez down to the police station where they interviewed him. Before I go into what took place in the interview, I would like the board members to consider, who Mr. Gonzalez was at the time. Again, he was a 16-year-old who up until that year had not been in any trouble at all. Mr. Gonzalez was on probation. Mr. Gonzalez is thinking that he's not going to be tried for this because he didn't do it. He thinks he's going to go to jail because he was at the party and in the car and all types of things. So during this interview, the detective is asking him questions over and over and over again until he gets out of Mr. Gonzalez what he wants him to say. Mr. Gonzalez said many things, and I, unlike the finding, am not going to gloss over the bad facts or the facts that don't support Mr. Gonzalez's claims. There are statements that Mr. Gonzalez made in that interview that are downright damning, and they just don't look right. But it is not evidence of Mr. Gonzalez being guilty and taking part of any shooting. Mr. Gonzalez said he saw these gentlemen. They were on the corner. He says that they were throwing up gang signs, giving hard stares. He said that Mitch said something to him like, "What are you looking at?" or "Where you from?" or something like that. And he says that as soon as his car had stopped, because everyone had to stop at the stop sign and then proceed on, his car stopped, they proceeded on, and as they proceeded on, shots were fired. Mr. Gonzalez told detectives that he had went to the party and he gave names. He gave the names of the two gentlemen that he went to the party with that night. He told them that he didn't know the exact address of the guy who was driving, but he could take detectives to where he was so they can talk to him and they can investigate and they can find out whether or not Mr. Gonzalez and his friends were the shooter. They didn't do it. They decided to close and wrap their investigation up that day, less than 24 hours, and never, ever looked for anyone else. Never, ever looked to substantiate Mr. Gonzalez's alibi. It was nothing connecting Mr. Gonzalez to this case at all. I want to mention this. When Mr. Gonzalez got down to the police station, he was given a GSR, a gunshot residue test. Mr. Gonzalez had 2 particles of gunshot residue on his hand. It was a big to-do made about this gunshot residue and the statements that Mr. Gonzalez made inside of this interrogation. But when it got to trial, the state's own witness, the expert witness, said that 2 shots of particles of gunshots hours after should not be there. And if they are there, the more reasonable explanation would be that they came from transfer. Mr. Gonzalez was snatched out of his bed by officers who carry guns. He was placed in handcuffs by officers who carry guns. He was put on the ground while they searched the house by officers who carry guns. He was placed in the backseat of a squad car by officers who carry guns. He was then taken to the police station and locked on a bench by officers who carry guns. And he was interviewed and interrogated by officers who carry guns. Those particles are nothing that the board should base its finding on in any way at all. It is nothing more than exactly what the federal court said, which is an inference that has somehow found its way to be evidence of guilt. Mr. Gonzalez told the investigator in an interrogation room many things, but what he didn't say was that he fired shots. What he didn't say was that his vehicle was where the shots came from. And of the things that he did say, some of which can be questionable, he was consistent in that he didn't fire any shots. He was consistent in that he gave the investigators an opportunity to rule him out. But instead, it was like, no, we got what we need. You were wearing a hat. Someone said they seen a guy wearing a hat, but they never mentioned whether or not Mr. Gonzalez was the only person at this party who was seen wearing a hat. Never at all. So when the victims, to be specific in terms of the inaccuracies, first, no witnesses at all. Like I said before, said it was a red Cadillac at all. There is Anthony, who was a victim. He was asked about the car, the identification of the car or the suspect who was firing shots from the car. His response is, it was kind of a new car. It was black, I remember, and it had rims. Asked if he knew what kind of car it was, he responded, I'm not sure. Michael, Anthony's brother, who was also shot that night. Michael testified, when asked while he was standing talking, did he remember seeing any cars drive by? His testimony, there were a lot of cars that drove by. Then he was asked if he remembered seeing a black car drive by and answered, not sure, there was cars driving in all directions. He was then asked, do you remember seeing a black car coming down the street? He answered no. Michael was asked, did the gentleman that asked you before the guy in the black car point the gun, did you recognize Mr. Gonzalez? His testimony was no. Each and every witness, all of the victims said that they could not make out the identity of the suspect, but that's not all. There was one victim who specifically said it was not Mr. Gonzalez. He saw the shooter and he said he didn't even see Mr. Gonzalez at all that night at the party. Nevertheless, Mr. Gonzalez was still tried. And I want to take this time to make an argument to the court that the state knew they had problems with this case. They knew that the victims did not identify Mr. Gonzalez, and one victim went as far as to say that it was not Mr. Gonzalez. So how did they get over the hump? They introduced the testimony of a prejudicial gang expert to talk about the propensity for violence that gang members have, to talk about gang members in specifically documented gang members of the gang that Mr. Gonzalez was associated with. They went as far as to say that there were members who committed home invasions, robberies, shootings. This prejudiced the jury because this gang expert had absolutely no dealings at all with Mr. Gonzalez ever. But he opined in front of a jury, and the jury is sitting there, and Mr. Gonzalez's attorney, who is now disbarred, put on absolutely no witness. None at all. None. Mr. Gonzalez was found guilty. He was sentenced to a term of 86 years in prison, but he didn't stop fighting. And I am proud about the next chapter of Mr. Gonzalez's story that I'll tell you. Mrs. Gonzalez didn't have a graduate education. He didn't have college experience. All he had was his high school education. And when he went to prison, he decided not to get involved and wave the white flag and fights and stuff like that. Mr. Gonzalez decided to go to the law library, where he researched his case, and where after decision after decision after decision was denied, he continued to stay steadfast and argue to the courts. Mr. Gonzalez drafted his own habeas that was eventually appointed counsel. And his argument was the same argument that I'm making today. So Mr. Gonzalez, while inside of prison, was able to litigate his way to the Ninth Circuit Court that is binding, which I'll get to later in their findings. Mr. Gonzalez did more than just litigate his way to the Ninth Circuit. He also attempted to find the two guys that he was with, the two friends that his attorney failed to go and try to hire an investigator to go get as well. Mind you, Mr. Gonzalez is doing all of this again. He's 19 years old now. He doesn't have any resources, hadn't heard from his mother in years since the incarceration. He's pretty much on an island by himself. So this case makes it in front of the Ninth Circuit, and the Ninth Circuit overturns, but they don't just overturn and overturn under the usual. And I'll say the usual, after going through the California Victims Board and reviewing all of the PC 4900s, for the most part, when these convictions, such as Mr. Gonzalez's, is overturned, they're usually overturned because of the lawyer's deficiency. That's not the case here. I believe that the Ninth Circuit could have found that his attorney was ineffective for not going to verify his alibi and presenting it in front of the jury and not presenting any witnesses at all. But they didn't. They instead found that the evidence in the case was constitutionally insufficient to support a finding of guilt, which is where we are now. Mr. Gonzalez has the burden to prove that he is more likely than not innocent of the accusations. I cannot fathom how someone can look at this record in its totality and also look at the additional evidence that was added, which was after Mr. Gonzalez was able to find me, I was able to locate this friend that he was with, the one who was driving the vehicle. This friend's name was Anthony, and Anthony submitted an affidavit in support of not just this hearing, but there was also the factual finding of innocence, which didn't turn in Mr. Gonzalez's favor, which I'll also take it a moment to address. When Mr. Gonzalez had his conviction overturned, Mr. Gonzalez was out and he was married. He had married a young lady while he was incarcerated, but he was absolutely alienated from his entire family. He didn't really have much of a relationship with his mother, with his brothers, because for 10 years and much of the critical maturation stage in a young man's life, he was in prison. So he got out and he found my firm by way of a suggestion. Before I was an attorney, I was also in Mr. Gonzalez's shoes. I was wrongfully convicted of a crime, spent 10 years in prison. I drafted my own habeas, and with the help of the Wisconsin Innocence Project, I got out, went to school, became an attorney, and it was an honor and a pleasure to represent Mr. Gonzalez in this matter. We went to the factual finding of innocence, and we did so because I was concerned about Mr. Gonzalez. And when we think about the reason why we're here, we're thinking about arguing that Mr. Gonzalez is a victim, and he truly is. Mr. Gonzalez would call me in the middle of the night and just would simply want to talk. He couldn't sleep. He would wake up at times as if he was still in his cell, as if he was under attack. So after him filing this initial victims compensation petition, I joined in and amended it. There were things that prolonged it, but out of the necessity to get Mr. Gonzalez the resources, not just financial, but also mental health care, I decided to go and try to petition for the factual finding of innocence, because I thought that a court, knowing what the Ninth Circuit had ruled, would no way decide to retry him with the same evidence that was said to be constitutionally insufficient. I was wrong. I was wrong. And deciding not to appeal, we came and we did the hearing because we believe that the Ninth Circuit's ruling is binding, and that if the evidence was insufficient to support a finding of guilt, then I don't want to say tie, but that's the best word I can use. Then it's a tie. So now if Mr. Gonzalez comes and he supports his claim of innocence with his own testimony, and he also supports his claim of innocence with a witness 10 years later that could have been found that very night, who said that he was the one driving, who described the vehicle that he was in, who said that he didn't fire the shots, who gave his contact information so anyone could have called, could have sent out an investigator. No one did. That's what you won't hear. You won't hear anyone stand up here today and say they went to go verify Mr. Gonzalez's alibi, which would really have told us that day and now whether or not it happened. So now Mr. Gonzalez is in front of this board. And although there's a monetary amount that is definitely here, I don't believe that any dollar amount is going to fix Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez needs a heavy dose of therapy. He needs a heavy dose of love. And this right now is a hearing that is being made to not just further victimize Mr. Gonzalez, but it's also victimizing the community. The community doesn't do well having someone who spent 10 years in prison out amongst the community with no resources, in desperate need of mental health care. There has to be another way. This is, in my opinion, a form of punishment, and I'll reserve a moment of time if it pleases the board and stop there and ask that the board decide in Mr. Gonzalez's favor and overrule the submission that he should not be compensated.
Thank you, Mr. Adams, for that information. We will now hear from Mr. Barton Bowers of the Attorney General's office.
Yes, good morning. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Very good. I apologize. I'm having a problem with my video feed. So in abundance of caution, I turned that off. Madam Chairwoman and Member Chavarro, I'll be very brief. The proposed decision is correct in all essential respects, and it should be adopted. Based on all the evidence in the record, including the evidence presented at the hearing before the hearing officer, the officer came to reasonable credibility determinations and reasonable conclusions based on the facts and the law, and the decision should be upheld. If the board has any specific questions, I'm happy to answer them. Otherwise, I'll simply add that the proposed decision be adopted. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bowers. Is there any discussion on this item? Member
No.
Chavarro?
No.
Do I have a motion on this item?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, I move staff recommendation.
Is there any public comment? Sorry, Andrea, is there public comment? Hearing none. Council, will you call the roll?
Member Chavarro,
Aye.
Chairperson Richardson.
Also aye.
Motion passes.
The board will now convene into closed session pursuant to Government Code Section 11126C3 to discuss numbers 1 through 47 of the Victim Compensation Program.
I'm sorry. I didn't hear that. So the motion was to deny Mr. Gonzalez.
We are adopting.
I can't hear you. I'm sorry.
Sorry about that. I was on mute. Yes, we are adopting the motion from the presented by the Attorney General's office.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Again, we will now adjourn into closed session. Thank you. Okay. So the board is now reconvening into open session pursuant to the Government Code Section 11126C3. Do I have a motion for numbers 1 through 47 of the Victim Compensation Program?
Yes, I'll move staff recommendation on all items.
I second that motion. Second that motion to approve numbers 1 through 47 of the Victim Compensation Program.
That's a song.
Yeah, exactly. Council, will you please call the roll?
Member Shavaro,
Aye.
Chairperson Richardson.
I enthusiastically also are aye.
The motion to approve numbers 1 through 47 of the Victim Compensation Program as recommended in the proposed decisions passes.
Okay. Is there any other business that needs to come before the board today?
None.
None here also. Seeing none, do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
All right, I second the motion to adjourn. Council, will you please call the roll?
Member Shavaro,
Aye.
Chairperson Richardson.
Also aye. The next meeting is scheduled to occur on October 15th. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.